If you search for Dead Space on the Nintendo Switch eShop, well, okay, nothing actually appears. But I mean, this game's called Deep Space. And look at the thumbnail. That is clearly a bizarro version of Isaac from the Dead Space games, who I choose to call Ballsack. I'm surprised the developers didn't pull a Hollow World Dark Knight and call it Deep Space Dead Shooter or something. But maybe Nintendo's finally starting to care about what appears on the eShop? Based on the fact that there's nearly 10,000 games on it, I'd have to say no. So, you know when you go to someone's house and they'll ask you to take your shoes off? Well, I ask people to take their shoes and socks off. While I may pretend that it's to protect my new floors from scuff marks, deep down everyone knows it's a shameful ruse to get my house smelling like the one thing you can't recreate in a lab, fresh feet. And yet that doesn't hold a scented candle to how shameful Deep Space is when it comes to knocking off Dead Space. Priced at $7 regularly, I bought Deep Space Action Fire Sci-Fi Game 2023 Shooter Strike Simulator Alien Death Ultimate Games for 6 cents. Yes, the publisher, Midnight Works, believes so much in their games that they sell them for 6 cents at launch. And if you look at the title on the Switch home screen, there's literally more hyphens in the game's name than the number of pennies I spent on it. When I went into the controls though, things seemed promising. A lot of these shovelware copycat titles ignore most of the buttons on your controller, but Deep Space had things like reloading and sprinting. And believe it or not, those are considered features when it comes to shovelware. Alright, let's do a little roleplay. I'll be a young, helpless, innocent little boy, and you'll be the hot alien queen who's taken me to explore the depths of the human body. Now, imagine that scenario, except it's also a video game in the same vein as Dead Space. What's the first thing you'd include? Exactly, a way to play with the members. But Deep Space decided that the dismemberment of Dead Space wasn't actually integral to the experience. Instead, they thought enemies should have numbers appear on them with every bullet they take. Much scarier. I'll eviscerate the devs on the description of Deep Space in a moment, but I want to give you my overall thoughts first. It opens with you walking out of a cryopod tube thing, then you have to spend a few minutes finding the one cupboard you can interact with. After that, it's a ton of aimless running around in circles to hold down the A button on several terminals. But after about 15 minutes, you get a gun and the action begins. Except the action is depthless. I'm assuming that's a word. You get locked in a small corridor, then blow your load inside the same couple of enemies, reload, and do it all over again. The shooting has zero impact whatsoever and feels more generic than the lingerie your mother buys from Target. But if you read the description for Deep Space, you'd think this is the greatest Dead Space clone ever made, all for the low price of 6 cents. The first sentence says there's stunningly realistic graphics. When Ballsack puts on the futuristic spacesuit, his arm is still bare. How is that realistic? I will somewhat agree with the eerie atmosphere, as you can sometimes hear a necrophiliac howling in the distance, but I massively disagree with the highly interactive part. Yeah, you open a bunch of doors and hold A on some terminals. That doesn't mean it's highly interactive. Or at the very least, it doesn't mean that highly interactive is a good thing. I mean, a bra with 100 hooks on it is technically highly interactive, but it doesn't mean I want to spend an hour on doing it. As you'd expect with these types of games, there's several spelling mistakes and translation errors, like the word passengers replaced with passagers. In the description though, apparently you wake up in a sarcophagus instead of a cryopod. Are you a mummy? I would have thought Ballsack would be more of a daddy. They also mention a multitude of enemies. There's 3, the grubs, the necrophiliacs, and the slightly more aggressive necrophiliacs. There's also the alien queen who doesn't do anything and just lets you kill her, except the description says it's the most difficult to defeat. If by most difficult they mean a mobile damage sponge, then yes it is. Finally, it says there's a third part of the game where you escape the ship. That's a lie. After about 40 minutes I pushed a button and somebody else escaped. Then a bunch of enemies charged towards me. While I was in the middle of fighting them, the game abruptly ended. I had to record the clip on my Switch and watch it back frame by frame. Apparently this is just chapter 1, because when I hit play again, everything restarted. All in all, this game has more dead space than my bed in the last few weeks I was with my ex-wife. Deep Space is a bland, bad game that nobody should buy, not even for 6 cents. But that isn't the end of the shameless ripoffs. No, they're just beginning. While Dead Space doesn't exist on Switch, do you know what does? Plants vs. Zombies Battle for Neighborville. Yet these developers decided to copy it, so blatantly that it appears when you search for Plants vs. Zombies on the eShop. It's like I always say, if you're trying to fill a hole, make sure nobody else has beaten you to it. I've never played the Garden Warfare sequel, but I did play the original, so I'm well versed in smoking plants. So how does Zombie Garden vs. Plants Defense Battlecraft and Survival Simulator game compare to the original, which is a spin-off of the main Plants vs. Zombies series, which is drastically different from the shooter game that Garden Warfare ended up being? Well, because I don't know what the world is anymore, this is a real-time tower defense game. It's not Plants vs. Zombies, it's not Garden Warfare. It's sort of a mishmash of the two, like when I asked my ex-wife to wear a Judi Dench mask that one time. Except unlike that time, this combination didn't satisfy me. The core concept is fine. You plant plants, then exploit cheap laborers who chop down trees and fetch water, thus growing your resources. All the zombies were rich in their lives, so they each drop a coin when they die, which you can use to buy more cheap labor. But I cannot tell you how frustrating the wave design is. Most games in this genre have a fast forward button. Not Zombie Garden. You have to endure every second of the agonizingly slow gameplay. It was like trying to teach my son how to fly his first plane at the age of 4. It took way too long and I wish I'd never even tried it in the first place. I'm not joking when I say the second level took me nearly 20 minutes to beat. Not because I suck, I actually played perfectly, but because it's so poorly designed. Had they just done smaller, faster paced levels, maybe the blatant ripoff might have been passable. Also, while it's cool that Farmer Dan has a baseball bat to beat off enemies, I think it would have made more sense for it to be a scythe or a pitchfork. What the hell is going on with his fox dog? Like my own dog, it literally never does anything useful. It doesn't bite zombies, it doesn't get attacked by zombies, and it doesn't fetch the coins that the zombies drop. Why would you risk your dog in a zombie apocalypse for no reason? In terms of content, there's only 5 levels in Zombie Garden. After the first 2, I wished it had ended there. To the developer's credit, the maps do change slightly and new zombies are introduced, but the balancing misses the mark more than my son when he tried to land that first time. In level 3, the developers just throw horde after horde of zombies at you, except the coins you earn aren't enough to keep up with the onslaught. After breezing through the first 2 levels, I tried 4 separate times to beat level 3 and never got past wave 7 out of 10. However, because I've smacked my head too many times on the cockpit doors, I spent the next hour trying to beat it and finally succeeded. How did I do it when the game is so clearly designed to stop this from happening? Well, it's like my hero Tom Brady always says, if you're not cheating, you're not trying. By whacking off a singular zombie with your stick for 5 to 10 minutes at the end of a wave, you can allow your workers to build up the materials you need. It's literally the only way I saw success. Otherwise, I'd get overwhelmed just a few waves in. Had the developers put some thought into how each level progresses, like time between waves to set up, workers who can be upgraded, a melee attack that actually does something, enemies who don't just spawn en masse and bait your trees so you're not constantly running back and forth, I might have had more favorable things to say about Zombie Garden. Instead, this is one game that should remain buried. Get it? It's a zombie joke. Never mind. Because I like doing things in threes, especially sisters, I also bought Tales of Shinobi Fantasy Magic Anime World Fight RPG Simulator. Being that it was only 6 cents, I had low expectations. But then I read the description. The developers promised a beautiful open world map as well as satisfying action combat. So now I was expecting The Witcher 3. Unfortunately, what I got was... well, nothing really rhymes with Witcher that means bad. Ditcher? I mean, it's not your mother, but yes, I do wish the publisher had ditched this one. Skipping past the technical issues like freezing, stuttering, and pop-in that is still somehow better than Scarlet and Violet, Tales of Shinobi has awful combat. The first enemy you face is a goblin, except you don't have any magic unlocked yet, so you have to use the punch button. Apparently, Shinobi is an aerialist or something because he flies around the screen seemingly at random, rarely ever hitting his target. Once you get lucky enough to kill that first goblin, you do unlock a magical attack. It sends some weak cyclones towards the enemies and never really seems to do all that much, so I died and had to go back to the town, thankfully keeping my magical spell. At that point, I decided to explore the beautiful open world. So, you know when they invented foot molds, allowing you to copy the foot of any person? It removed the personableness. Sure, it may look like a foot, but it doesn't feel, taste, or smell like the real thing. Basically, the creators only asked if they could, not if they should. That's the case with Shinobi's open world. I think they were going with something similar to Breath of the Wild, and fell on their face more than my son after I tied his laces together for a YouTube video. I wandered around for a few minutes, found a couple groups of enemies, beat a wolf stuck inside a mountain, and returned to the town. The world is utterly vacant of anything unless you count invisible walls. There's no map, no quests, and no points of interest, so all that was left was going through the portal again. I went back, and instead of this crazy open world RPG that they seemed to promise, Tales of Shinobi becomes a wave-based battler inside a tiny room. I got my character to level 54 and wave 22, then just gave up. The enemies were laughably easy thanks to the increasingly powerful spells, and nothing ever seemed to happen. My reward for beating a bunch of goblins was more goblins. I assume there's an end to the wave of enemies at some point and maybe a boss fight somewhere, but I wasn't going to spend an hour beating off knowing I may never reach completion. Maybe when I was younger, but I'm much too old now.